Can't afford a car, my sister joked. Mom sighed. It's just junk. Everyone laughed loudly. I smirked and called, bring the ghost. 5 minutes later. They looked out. Sister fainted. The ocean breeze rolling in from the Pacific is supposed to be calming. That is what the real estate agent told me when I bought this $15 million estate in Malibu 6 months ago. But standing on my expansive glass balcony, watching the waves crash against the shoreline, I felt nothing but a familiar, heavy knot tightening in my stomach. The phone vibrating in my hand was the cause. The caller ID flashed a name I usually ignored, Harrison. My older brother. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my thumb across the screen. I did not even get a chance to say hello before his booming, overly confident voice filled my ear. Sienna, he barked, skipping any form of pleasantry. You need to book a flight home by tomorrow. It is time for a family meeting. I leaned against the glass railing, keeping my voice entirely neutral. What is going on, Harrison? It is Mom and Dad, he sighed, adopting that dramatic, put-on tone of a martyr carrying the weight of the world. Mom took a bad fall and messed up her hip. She can barely walk around the house. And Dad, well, his dementia is getting worse. He wandered out to the mailbox yesterday and could not remember how to get back to the front door. We have to discuss long-term care facilities, and we need to talk about money. I expect you to be here. It is time you finally stepped up and contributed whatever spare change you can scrape together. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. He was 38 years old, a mid-level executive at a tech firm who lived entirely on credit, but he still spoke to me like I was a rebellious teenager begging for an allowance. I will be there, I said softly, giving him no emotion to feed on. Good. Don't be late. And try to look presentable for once, he added before hanging up. I lowered the phone, staring out at the endless blue water. My empire, EcoTrack, the company I built from absolutely nothing in a roach-infested apartment, had just been acquired for $40 million. I had more money sitting in my checking account right now than Harrison would see in 3 lifetimes. But he didn't know that. None of them did. To my family, I was still 28-year-old Sienna, the college dropout, the black sheep, the poor little sister who could never quite get her life together. I turned and walked back into my massive, sunlit living room. My assistant, Delaney, was waiting by the kitchen island, holding an iPad and looking concerned. She had heard enough of the conversation to know what was happening. Cancel my afternoon meetings for the rest of the week, I told her, walking toward the hallway. And pull my old canvas backpack out of the storage closet. Delaney followed me, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Sienna, are you sure you want to do this? You have a closet full of tailored suits and designer wear. You could fly private. You could land a helicopter on their front lawn if you wanted to. I walked into my closet, bypassing the rows of silk shirts and custom jackets. I reached into a dark corner and pulled out a faded, oversized gray sweater with a slightly frayed collar and a pair of worn-out jeans. No, I said, tossing the old clothes onto the velvet ottoman. If I show up looking like a CEO, their walls will go up. They will play nice, and they will try to leech off me. I need them to show their true colors. I need them to see the version of me they created in their own heads. They only understand the failure they desperately want me to be. Delaney sighed, knowing better than to argue when I had that tone in my voice. All right. Coach class on a commercial airline. Middle seat, I replied, grabbing my battered old backpack. Let's give them exactly what they expect. The air inside the commercial cabin was stale, smelling faintly of cheap coffee and recycled breath. I was squeezed into seat 34B, pinned between a businessman snoring loudly against the window and a teenager aggressively chewing gum on the aisle. My knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of me. I could have chartered a private jet and been in San Diego with a glass of champagne in my hand, but this discomfort was necessary. It grounded me. It reminded me of where I came from and, more importantly, what I had escaped. Staring straight ahead at the scratched plastic back of the seat, my mind drifted back over the last 10 years. The narrative my family spun at every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner was that I was a stubborn, lazy dreamer who refused to get a real job. The truth was a much uglier story of survival. When I left Pine Valley 10 years ago, I had exactly $300 to my name. I took a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles and rented a miserable, windowless studio apartment in Koreatown. The walls were so thin I could hear my neighbors breathing, and the kitchen was a permanent home for a family of cockroaches. I spent 2 solid years eating nothing but 75-cent ramen noodles and canned beans. My clothes hung off my frame because I could not afford 3 meals a day. But I was not doing nothing. I was coding. I worked grueling 18-hour days, staring at a cracked laptop screen until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I took on terrible, underpaid freelance programming gigs just to keep the lights on, while pouring every remaining ounce of my energy into building EcoTrek. I wanted to create an algorithm that allowed large corporations to trace and offset their carbon emissions in real time. People called me crazy. Investors laughed me out of their offices, telling me a young girl with no college degree had no business pitching enterprise software. But I kept pushing. The rejections fueled me. The hunger fueled me. And slowly, the tide turned. Small companies signed on. Then mid-sized firms. Then, a massive logistics corporation adopted my software, and the dominoes finally fell. 6 months ago, a major tech conglomerate bought EcoTrek entirely. I signed the paperwork, watched $40 million hit my bank account, and went home to my empty apartment. I did not celebrate. I did not buy a sports car that day. I just slept for 14 hours straight, the heavy weight of poverty finally lifting off my chest. So why keep it a secret? Why let my brother and sister continue to look down on me from their imaginary pedestals? Because my family's love was strictly conditional. They only respected you if you fit into their neat, suburban mold of success. If you wore the right brands, leased the right cars, and gossiped at the right country clubs. If they knew I had money, the mocking would stop, but the manipulation would begin. They would swarm like locusts, holding their hands out, claiming they supported me all along. I refused to let them rewrite history. I needed this weekend. I needed to look them in the eyes while they thought I was worthless, just to confirm that cutting them out of my heart completely was the right decision. The plane touched down in San Diego with a harsh jolt, snapping me out of my memories. I grabbed my faded backpack from under the seat, slung it over my shoulder, and joined the slow, shuffling line of passengers heading toward the exit. The humid Southern California air hit my face as I walked out of the terminal. I bypassed the sleek black luxury car service lane and walked straight toward the standard taxi stand. I climbed into an older sedan that smelled strongly of pine air freshener and gave the driver my childhood address in Pine Valley. As the cab rattled onto the highway, I took a deep breath. The ghost of my past was waiting for me. Watching the familiar rolling hills and endless vineyards of Pine Valley blur past the taxi window, a bitter taste rose in the back of my throat. This town always looked so idyllic on the outside, a haven of wine-tasting rooms and perfectly manicured lawns. But for me, it was the site of the original sin. The betrayal that severed my family ties forever. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, letting the memory pull me back. I was 18 years old. It was the summer right after I graduated high school. While my older sister Cassidy was busy obsessing over her Instagram aesthetic and my brother Harrison was climbing the corporate ladder at an established software firm, I was locked in my bedroom, writing the very first lines of code for what would eventually become EcoTrek. I was so incredibly proud of that early prototype. I thought, naively, that my family would be proud of me too. One evening, I practically dragged Harrison into my room and forced him to sit at my desk. I explained the entire concept to him. I showed him how the algorithm calculated emission data and how businesses could use it to save millions in tax credits while helping the environment. Harrison had nodded along, stroking his chin. He asked incredibly specific questions about the back-end architecture and how the data encryption worked. I answered every single one, thrilled that my successful older brother was finally taking my hobby seriously. 3 months later, the illusion shattered. We were all sitting around the heavy oak dining table for Sunday dinner. Harrison was practically glowing. He proudly announced to our parents that he had just secured a massive promotion and a $50,000 bonus. When my dad proudly asked what project earned him such a reward, Harrison smiled smugly. He described, in vivid detail, a new environmental tracking initiative he had pitched to his board of directors. He described my algorithm. He described my idea, right down to the specific user interface concepts I had drawn for him in a notebook. I dropped my fork. It clattered loudly against the porcelain plate. "That is my idea," I whispered, staring at him in absolute shock. "Harrison, you stole my project." Harrison rolled his eyes, taking a calm sip of his wine. "Oh, calm down, Sienna. You had a cute little concept for a high school science fair. I took it, refined it, and made it viable for enterprise use. You really think a corporate board would buy software from a teenager? I did you a favor. I proved the concept works." I looked desperately at my parents, expecting them to intervene, expecting them to demand he apologize. Instead, my mother sighed heavily, looking at me with pure annoyance. "Sienna, please do not start drama at the dinner table. Your brother worked very hard for this promotion. Why can't you just be happy for him? He stole from me." I yelled, tears of absolute betrayal stinging my eyes. My sister Cassidy, who was 22 at the time, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "God, you are so delusional, Sienna. Always playing the victim. You are just jealous because Harrison actually has a real job and a future, and you are sitting in your room playing on your computer. Grow up." That was the moment. That was the exact second the last thread connecting me to them snapped. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about the image. Harrison was the golden boy making money, so his theft was justified. I was just the weird, annoying youngest child, so my pain was irrelevant. I didn't argue anymore. I stood up from the table in total silence, walked upstairs to my room, and packed a single duffel bag. I emptied my meager savings jar, which held exactly $300, and I walked out the front door into the warm summer night. They thought I would be back in a week, begging for forgiveness. They were wrong. The taxi hit a pothole, jarring me back to the present. The driver turned down a familiar, tree-lined street. We were here. The house looked exactly the same, an upper-middle-class monument to suburban conformity. I paid the driver in cash, grabbed my faded backpack, and stepped out onto the driveway to face the lions. The gravel crunched under my worn-out sneakers as the taxi rattled away, leaving me standing at the edge of my parents' driveway. Before I could even take a step toward the front porch, the front door swung open. Harrison walked out. He looked exactly like the cliché he had worked so hard to become. He was wearing a pale pink Ralph Lauren polo shirt, crisp khaki shorts, and a pair of leather boat shoes. He leaned casually against his gleaming, dark blue BMW sedan, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked me up and down, his eyes scanning my frayed gray sweater and the scuff marks on my shoes. A smirk played on his lips. "Well," Harrison said, his voice dripping with faux amusement. "Look what the cat dragged in. I see you are still keeping the local thrift stores in business, Sienna." I adjusted the straps of my backpack, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "Hello, Harrison. It is good to see you too. How is Dad doing?" Harrison pushed off his car and walked toward me, not offering a hug, just invading my personal space to establish dominance. "Dad is losing it. And Mom is a nervous wreck. It has been a nightmare dealing with this on my own. It would have been nice if you actually answered your phone more than once every 6 months. But I guess when you are busy jumping from one minimum wage gig to another, time gets away from you." I swallowed the sharp retort burning on my tongue. "Let's just go inside." I walked past him and pushed open the heavy front door. The house smelled exactly as it always had, a mix of lavender air freshener and old wood. I found my parents in the living room. My dad was sitting in his worn leather recliner, staring blankly at a television that wasn't even turned on. His hair was much thinner, pure white, and his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the armrests. "Dad," I said softly, stepping into his line of sight. He blinked slowly, looking up at me. His eyes were foggy, searching my face for a long moment before a weak smile appeared. "Oh, hello there. Have you come to fix the television?" My heart cracked a little. The dementia was much worse than I had anticipated. "No, Dad. It's me. Sienna. He patted my hand gently, still looking confused but polite. Sienna. Right. Good girl. My mother walked in from the kitchen, using a shiny metal walker. She looked older, her face lined with stress. When she saw me, she let out a loud, theatrical sigh that was meant to sound relieved, but carried a heavy undertone of burden. "Oh, Sienna, you made it," she said, carefully maneuvering her walker toward me. She gave me a brief, one-armed hug. Immediately, she pulled back and looked at my clothes, her nose crinkling in subtle disgust. "Honey, you look so thin. And tired. Are you eating enough? It is okay to admit if you are struggling. We are family." "I am fine, Mom. Really. How's your hip?" She waved her hand dismissively. "It hurts constantly. But we make do." She paused, reaching into the pocket of her cardigan. In front of Harrison, who was watching from the doorway with a smirk, she pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and pressed it firmly into my hand. "Here," she whispered loudly, making sure Harrison could hear every word. "Please take this. Go down to the grocery store later and buy yourself some fresh fruit and maybe a decent sandwich. You look like you're starving. I don't want you going hungry just because you are too proud to ask for help." I looked down at the $20 bill in my palm. The urge to pull out my phone and show her my 8-figure bank balance was almost overwhelming. But I remembered the plan. I closed my fist around the money, forcing a grateful, submissive smile. "Thank you, Mom," I said quietly. "I appreciate it." Harrison scoffed loudly from the hallway. "Don't spend it all in one place, Sienna." The weekend had barely begun, and the trap was already being set. The dining room table was set with Mom's finest china, the plates reserved only for holidays, and when Harrison brought home a new corporate achievement to boast about. At exactly 6 in the evening, the front door burst open, and Cassidy made her grand entrance. She was 32, perfectly blown-out blonde hair, wearing a beige designer trench coat over a silk dress. She carried 3 oversized shopping bags covered in luxury logos, making sure they bumped against the doorframe loudly enough for everyone to notice. "I am here." "Sorry I am late. Traffic on the interstate was an absolute nightmare," Cassidy announced, sweeping into the dining room and kissing Mom dramatically on the cheek. She spotted me sitting quietly at the end of the table and paused. Her smile tightened. "Oh, Sienna, you actually showed up. And you were wearing that." "Good to see you, Cassidy," I replied mildly. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. Harrison poured expensive red wine, making a point to explain the vintage and the price tag to Dad, even though Dad was barely tracking the conversation. Cassidy dominated the discussion, complaining about the stress of managing a home renovation and how difficult it was to find a reliable pool cleaner for her suburban house. Halfway through the meal, Cassidy reached for the butter dish and clumsily knocked her wine glass over. A splash of dark red liquid splashed onto the polished wood table, dangerously close to Mom's good tablecloth. "Oh, goodness. How clumsy of me," Cassidy gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She looked directly at me, her tone dripping with sweet condescension. "Sienna, sweetie, be a dear and run to the kitchen for a wet rag. You were so good at cleaning up. You used to do housekeeping gigs for a while, right? You know the best way to get stains out." I had never worked as a housekeeper. I had been a freelance software engineer. But to Cassidy, any job that wasn't a salaried corporate position was essentially manual labor. I didn't argue. I stood up, walked to the kitchen in silence, retrieved a damp towel, and methodically wiped up the wine while my siblings watched with satisfied expressions. When dessert was served, Cassidy clapped her hands together. "Okay, presents. I know we are here for a serious meeting tomorrow, but I brought gifts to lift everyone's spirits." She reached into her designer bags. For Mom, she produced a beautifully wrapped box containing a pure cashmere scarf. For Dad, a set of engraved whiskey glasses. For Harrison, she handed over a sleek, leather-bound box. "An automatic watch winder," Cassidy beamed. "For your new Rolex. You cannot let a piece like that just sit on the dresser." Harrison grinned, opening the box to admire the velvet interior. "Thanks, Cass. This is perfect. Then, Cassidy turned to me. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, plain white envelope. She slid it across the table toward me. Her smile was impossibly sweet, the kind of smile that hit a razor blade. I didn't forget you, Sienna, she said gently. I know things have been really tight for you lately. I wanted to help out. I opened the envelope. Inside was a plastic gift card for a notoriously cheap, discount department store. The amount written in Sharpie on the back was $15. I figured you could use it to buy a nice, clean blouse, Cassidy continued, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. You know, something appropriate for job interviews. You cannot go into an office wearing baggy sweaters. It is time you find a decent, stable job, sweetie. No more living out of a backpack. We just want to see you succeed like the rest of us. Mom nodded in agreement, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. Your sister is right, Sienna. It is a very thoughtful gift. You should thank her. I looked at the $15 piece of plastic. In my wallet, tucked deep in my backpack upstairs, was a heavy, solid metal black card that could buy the entire department store chain she was talking about. I looked up at Cassidy's triumphant face and then at Harrison's mocking grin. I slid the card into my jeans pocket and offered them a warm, completely empty smile. Thank you, Cassidy. This is exactly what I needed. You are incredibly generous. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, disappointed that I hadn't cried or argued. But the real game hadn't even started yet. The house finally fell silent around midnight. My old childhood bedroom felt like a museum of a life I no longer recognized. The walls were still painted a pale yellow, and the single twin bed groaned every time I shifted my weight. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind buzzing with the quiet rage I had been suppressing all evening. My throat was dry. I slipped quietly out of bed, opening the bedroom door with practiced caution to avoid the squeaky hinge, and padded barefoot down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen. The house was completely dark, save for a faint, pale strip of light spilling onto the kitchen tiles from the sliding glass door that led to the backyard patio. As I poured a glass of cold water from the fridge, I heard the low murmur of voices. The sliding glass door was cracked open a few inches to let the cool night air in. Harrison and Cassidy were out there on the patio. I paused, the glass halfway to my lips. I stepped silently into the shadows near the door, pressing my back against the wall to listen. I am telling you, we cannot just pay for everything, Harrison was saying. I heard the clink of a glass he was drinking. Mom and Dad's savings are basically gone. The memory care facility I picked out for Dad is elite. It is expensive. I am not draining my accounts to cover all of it while little Miss Dropout skates by without contributing a dime. I know, Harry, Cassidy replied, her voice lacking the fake sweetness she used at the dinner table. It sounded hard, calculating. But you know she is broke. Look at her shoes. She probably barely makes rent. That is exactly the point, Harrison said, a cruel chuckle escaping him. Tomorrow at the meeting, I am going to run the numbers. I will say you and I are covering 90% of the costs out of the goodness of our hearts. And we will leave her with the remaining 10%. It comes out to about $800 a month. Cassidy gasped softly. 800? Harrison, that will absolutely bury her. She cannot afford that. She will default on her rent in 2 months. Exactly, Harrison said, his tone turning vicious. It is time she faced some actual consequences for her pathetic life choices. She pays the $800. It ruins her credit. She gets evicted from whatever dump she is renting in LA. And then what happens? She has nowhere to go. She will be forced to move back into this house. She can be the free live-in nurse for Mom and Dad. It solves our problem perfectly. We get premium care for Dad, Mom gets a housekeeper, and we don't have to deal with hiring full-time help. I stopped breathing. The sheer, calculating malice of his plan was staggering. This wasn't about caring for our parents. This wasn't even about sharing the financial burden. This was a targeted, deliberate plot to financially ruin me, to strip away my independence, and to turn me into their indentured servant just so they could maintain their comfortable, upper-middle-class lifestyles. Wow, Cassidy murmured, taking a sip of her drink. That is Actually brilliant. It will finally force her to grow up. And honestly, it serves her right for acting so aloof all these years. Did you see her face when I gave her that cheap gift card? She is so arrogant, pretending she doesn't care. She will care when the bill comes due, Harrison sneered. Tomorrow morning, we trap her. If she refuses, I will bring up filial responsibility laws and threaten to sue her for parental neglect. She won't have a choice. I stood in the darkness of the kitchen for a long time after their voices faded into idle gossip. My hand was shaking, not from sadness, but from a cold, absolute fury. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the voice memo app. I hit record, capturing the last minute of their cruel laughter drifting through the cracked door. I didn't need water anymore. I walked back to my bedroom, my bare feet completely silent on the floorboards. I sat on the edge of the squeaky twin bed, opened my messaging app, and pulled up my thread with Delaney. I typed a single sentence: have Gage ready the vehicles by 9 a.m. tomorrow. The trap was set, but Harrison and Cassidy had no idea who was actually walking into it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story interesting, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you very much. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was thick and suffocating, like the air right before a thunderstorm. I walked into the living room at 9 o'clock sharp, holding a mug of black coffee. Harrison had physically rearranged the furniture. He had pushed the coffee table against the wall and set up a portable projector screen in the middle of the room. A PowerPoint presentation was glowing brightly on the canvas. The title slide read, Parental Care Strategy and Financial Allocation. He was treating our family tragedy like a quarterly earnings call. Harrison stood next to the screen wearing a freshly pressed dress shirt and a silk tie, though I noticed the cuffs of his shirt were slightly frayed, a subtle detail that did not escape me. Cassidy was sitting on the sofa, her legs crossed, scrolling through her phone with an air of complete boredom. Mom and Dad were seated in their recliners. Dad looked entirely lost, staring at the bright light of the projector, while Mom nervously clutched the handles of her aluminum walker. I took a seat on a stiff wooden dining chair in the corner, keeping my face entirely blank. All right, let's get down to business, Harrison began, clapping his hands together loudly. He clicked a remote, and the slide changed to a picture of a sprawling, resort-style building surrounded by manicured green lawns and water fountains. This is Sunset Valley Memory Care. It is the premier facility in the state. They offer around-the-clock medical staff, personalized cognitive therapy, a private golf course, and weekly wine tasting events for the residents. It is the only place suitable for Dad, and they have an assisted living wing for Mom. Mom leaned forward, her eyes wide with anxiety. Harrison, honey, that looks like a luxury hotel. Your father and I only have a small pension and what is left in our savings account. We cannot afford a place with a golf course. Harrison held up a hand, offering a patronizing, rehearsed smile. Mom, please. Let me finish. We are your children. It is our duty to ensure you live out your golden years in absolute comfort. We are not putting you in some state-run facility. We are talking about premium care, synergy between medical and lifestyle needs, and a high return on investment for your overall happiness. I took a slow sip of my coffee. He was using corporate buzzwords to describe a nursing home. It was sickening. He clicked to the next slide. A massive pie chart appeared on the screen, sliced into 3 uneven sections. Now let's talk about the numbers, Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave to sound more serious and authoritative. The total cost for both of you to live at Sunset Valley is $8,000 a month. I have already gone through your financial statements, Mom. Your savings will be completely depleted in less than a year if you pay out of pocket. Mom let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. $8,000 a month was an astronomical number to her. She looked at Dad, who was currently trying to unwrap a piece of hard candy, completely oblivious to the financial ruin being discussed in front of him. Do not panic, Mom, Cassidy chimed in smoothly, finally looking up from her phone. She offered a warm, perfectly manicured smile. Harrison and I have been talking, and we have come up with a solution. We are not going to let you two lose your house. Harrison nodded, pointing a laser pointer at the pie chart. Cassidy and I are both very successful. We have robust portfolios. So, out of the goodness of our hearts, we are going to cover 90% of the monthly cost. That is $7,200 a month that Cassidy and I will split evenly. You do not have to worry about a thing. Mom burst into tears. Oh, my sweet children. You are so generous. I do not know what we did to deserve you. I sat perfectly still, watching the performance. It was a brilliant, disgusting piece of theater. Harrison and Cassidy were playing the saviors, soaking up my mother's tearful gratitude. But I had heard them on the patio the night before. I knew exactly where the remaining 10% was going to land. Harrison turned his gaze toward me, his smug smile widening. The trap was opening. Harrison let the silence stretch for a moment, making sure the weight of his supposed generosity settled heavily over the room. Then he turned off the laser pointer and crossed his arms, staring directly at me. That leaves the remaining 10%, Harrison said, his voice dropping the friendly tone and taking on the sharp edge of a prosecutor. Which comes out to exactly $800 a month. And that, Sienna, is where you come in. Cassidy nodded enthusiastically, leaning forward on the sofa. Exactly. We feel it is only fair that you contribute to the family. $800 is practically nothing compared to what we are paying. It is the absolute bare minimum you can do. Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked at me, her expression a mix of pleading and expectation. Sienna, sweetie, your brother and sister are being so incredibly generous. Surely you can find a way to manage your share. Maybe you could take on some extra shifts at wherever it is you are working right now. I placed my coffee mug on the floor next to my chair. I looked at Harrison, keeping my voice steady and quiet. $800 a month is nearly $10,000 a year, Harrison. That is a massive financial commitment. Oh, cry me a river, Harrison scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. You are 28 years old, Sienna. It is time you grew up and took some responsibility. You cannot just drift through life, living in cheap apartments and playing on your computer, while the rest of us shoulder the burdens of adulthood. This will be good for you. It will teach you discipline. We are doing this for your own good, Cassidy added, dripping with toxic positivity. We believe in you, Sienna. But if we let you off the hook, we are just enabling your lazy lifestyle. You need a push to finally get a real, stable career. I stared at them. The gaslighting was so intense it was almost dizzying. They were trying to bankrupt me, trying to force me into eviction so I would have to become a live-in maid, and they were framing it as a favor. They wanted me to thank them for ruining my life. I am not signing any financial contracts today, I said flatly. I need to review the facility's paperwork and see the actual breakdown of these costs before I commit to paying a monthly fee. Harrison's face turned red. The friendly corporate facade cracked, revealing the ugly, controlling bully underneath. He took a step toward me, towering over my chair. You do not get to negotiate here, Sienna, he snarled, his voice echoing in the small living room. This is not a debate. You either agree to pay your share right now, or I swear to God, I will bring down the full weight of the law on you. Have you ever heard of filial responsibility laws? Because I have. I have a lawyer on retainer who would love to drag you into court and garnish whatever pathetic wages you make. Do not test me. I will ruin you if you turn your back on your family. Mom gasped at the threat, but she did not defend me. Instead, she looked at me with deep disappointment. Sienna, please. Why do you always have to make things so difficult? Your brother is just trying to help. Stop being so selfish. That word hung in the air. Selfish. I had spent the last 2 years eating ramen and working until my fingers bled, all while secretly funneling money to pay for Dad's early treatments, and I was the selfish one. The sheer audacity of their delusion was suffocating. They had completely convinced themselves of their own righteousness. I am not being selfish, I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I am just pointing out that you are demanding money from someone you constantly claim is completely broke. It does not make logical sense. Cassidy let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Logical sense? You want to talk about logic, Sienna? How about the logic of showing up to a family emergency looking like a homeless person? She stood up, smoothing down her designer skirt, preparing to deliver what she thought would be the final, crushing blow. Cassidy walked to the center of the room, pointing an accusatory finger at my faded jeans and worn-out sneakers. She was vibrating with self-righteous anger. She hated that I wasn't crying. She hated that I wasn't begging them for mercy. "You want us to pity you because you are broke?" Cassidy sneered, her voice shrill. "You did this to yourself, Sienna. You dropped out of college. You refused to listen to anyone. And now look at you. You are nearly 30 years old, and you cannot even afford a car. That taxi you rolled up in yesterday? It was pathetic. It smelled like an ashtray from the driveway." Mom sighed heavily, shaking her head. "Cassidy is right, dear. It is just junk. You don't have a dime to your name, and it breaks my heart, but we cannot pretend anymore. You have failed, Sienna. You just need to accept it and do what your brother says." Harrison threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a booming, cruel sound that bounced off the living room walls. Cassidy joined in, her high-pitched giggle mixing with his. Even Dad, who had no idea what was going on, saw them laughing and offered a confused, toothy chuckle. They were laughing at me. My entire family, standing in a circle, mocking the poverty they desperately believed I was trapped in. I looked at their faces. I looked at the contempt in my sister's eyes, the arrogant triumph in my brother's posture, and the pitying weakness of my mother. I had given them every chance. I had let them play their game, hoping to find just one shred of genuine empathy hidden beneath their toxic egos. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. It was time to pull the curtain down. I stopped holding back my posture. I sat up straight, my shoulders squaring. The timid, quiet youngest sister vanished instantly. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, a deliberate prop I had chosen for this trip, but it functioned perfectly. I opened my messages and sent Delaney a single emoji, a ghost. Then, while Harrison and Cassidy were still chuckling, I pulled up my recent contacts and hit the call button for Gage, my head of security and lead driver. I put the phone to my ear. He answered on the first ring. "Send the ghost," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden silence of the living room. "Now." I hung up and slid the phone back into my pocket. Harrison stopped laughing. He frowned, looking at me as if I had just sprouted a second head. "What the hell was that? Who are you calling? Did you just order another cheap cab?" Cassidy rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. "Oh, let her go, Harrison. If she wants to run away from her responsibilities like a coward, let her. She probably called her landlord to beg for an extension on her rent." "I am not running anywhere," I said, my voice calm, smooth, and laced with a quiet authority they had never heard from me before. I looked directly into Harrison's eyes, refusing to blink. "I am just leveling the playing field. We are not done with this meeting. We are just waiting for my ride to arrive." "Your ride?" Mom echoed, looking confused. "Sienna, what are you talking about?" "You will see in exactly 5 minutes," I replied. Harrison scoffed loudly, but I saw a tiny flicker of uncertainty cross his face. He hated not being in control of the room. He hated the sudden shift in my demeanor. "You are bluffing. You are trying to cause a scene to get out of paying your share. Well, it is not going to work. We can sit here all day." "Fine by me," I said, leaning back in my chair. For the next 5 minutes, the room was agonizingly quiet. Cassidy tapped her foot impatiently. Harrison checked his new Rolex every 30 seconds. And then, we heard it. It did not sound like a normal car. It was a deep, guttural rumble, a heavy vibration that you could feel in the floorboards before you could even hear the engines. The sound grew louder, a mechanical growl that completely shattered the quiet Sunday morning atmosphere of Pine Valley. Cassidy stopped tapping her foot. She walked over to the front window and pulled back the sheer curtain to look out into the street. The color instantly drained from her face. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She took a step back from the window, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the ceramic coffee mug she was holding. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark coffee splashing across her designer shoes. "Cassidy? What is it?" Mom asked, startled by the crash. There are men, Cassidy stammered, her voice barely a whisper. And cars. Harrison frowned, marching over to the window and shoving the curtain aside. His confident, arrogant posture evaporated the second his eyes met the street. He froze. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. I stood up from my wooden chair, brushing a piece of lint off my frayed sweater, and walked calmly to the front door. I pulled it open, letting the morning sunlight and the sheer, overwhelming presence of my reality flood into their tiny suburban world. Parked in the driveway, completely dwarfing Harrison's leased BMW, was a custom, pitch-black Rolls-Royce Ghost. The paint was so polished it looked like dark glass. But it did not arrive alone. Flanking the Rolls-Royce on the street, blocking the entire cul-de-sac, were two massive, black armored Cadillac Escalades. The sheer visual dominance of the convoy was staggering. The driver's side door of the Rolls-Royce opened, and Gage stepped out. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, built like a tank, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit with a discreet earpiece coiled behind his ear. He walked around to the rear passenger side with precise, military-like movements. Behind him, 4 other men in identical suits stepped out of the Escalades, taking strategic positions around the perimeter of the lawn. The neighbors were already coming out onto their porches, staring in shock at the spectacle. Gage stopped at the rear door of the Rolls-Royce, looking past Harrison and locking eyes with me. He reached out and pulled the heavy, rear-hinged suicide door open. "Good morning, Miss Sienna," Gage said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Your vehicle is ready." Behind me, in the living room, absolute silence reigned. Mom was clutching the handles of her walker, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dad was staring out the door, pointing at the shiny cars with childlike wonder. Cassidy had literally collapsed onto the sofa, her hands covering her face, unable to process what she was seeing. Harrison was paralyzed. His eyes darted from my scuffed sneakers to the $500,000 vehicle sitting on his parents' driveway, and then to the heavily armed private security detail surrounding it. His brain was desperately trying to calculate how the sister he had just threatened with eviction was now commanding a fleet of luxury armor. I turned back to face them. The timid youngest sister was dead. I was the CEO. "I told you," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority. "My ride is here." Harrison's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked at the Rolls-Royce, then back at me, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. The illusion of his superiority was shattering into a million pieces right in front of his eyes. "Sienna." He finally managed to croak out, his voice cracking. Whose cars are those? Are you in trouble? Who are these men?" I ignored his questions. I stepped fully into the doorway, commanding the space. "We are not finished with our family meeting," I announced coldly. "But I am done sitting in this suffocating house. Harrison, Cassidy. Get your things. You are coming with me." Cassidy peeked through her fingers from the sofa, her mascara slightly smudged. "Coming with you? Where?" "Sienna, what is going on?" "Get in the car, Cassidy," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Or I can have my security team carry you out. Your choice." Harrison tried to muster a fraction of his former bravado. He puffed out his chest, though his hands were visibly shaking. "You cannot just order us around. I am not getting in some strange vehicle. You owe us an explanation." I took one slow step toward him. "Harrison, you spent the last 24 hours insulting me, threatening to sue me, and conspiring to bankrupt me so I would become a live-in maid. You are going to walk out that door, get in the back of my car, and you are going to sit in silence until I allow you to speak. Do you understand me?" He looked at the icy fury in my eyes, then looked out at Gage, who had unbuttoned his suit jacket, subtly revealing the shoulder holster strapped to his chest. Harrison swallowed hard, the last ounce of his fight draining out of him. He nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. "Mom, Dad, we will be back by evening," I said softly, my tone softening just a fraction for them. Harrison and Cassidy stumbled out the front door like prisoners of war. They walked past the gleaming hood of the Rolls-Royce, terrified to even touch the paint. Gage gestured politely but firmly toward the open suicide door. They climbed into the back seat. I slid in after them, and Gage closed the heavy door with a solid, vault-like thud. The transition from the noisy suburban street to the interior of the Rolls-Royce was jarring. The soundproofing was absolute. It was dead silent. The air smelled of rich, hand-stitched leather and expensive cedar. Above our heads, the famous Starlight headliner glittered, thousands of tiny fiber-optic lights woven into the roof to mimic a starry night sky. Gage climbed into the driver's seat, separated from us by a thick glass partition. The engine roared to life, though in the back, it felt like nothing more than a gentle hum. The convoy pulled smoothly out of Pine Valley, heading toward the interstate. The drive to my estate in Malibu took 2.5 hours. It was the longest 2.5 hours of Harrison and Cassidy's lives. It was a psychological prison lined in cashmere and leather. I sat in the corner seat, staring out the tinted window, saying absolutely nothing. The silence was a weapon, and I let them bleed on it. Every time Cassidy opened her mouth to ask a question, I slowly turned my head, pinned her with a dead, emotionless stare, and she instantly snapped her mouth shut. They were trapped in a moving monument of extreme wealth, completely at the mercy of the sister they had spent a decade treating like garbage. Harrison kept nervously rubbing the leather armrest, his eyes darting around the cabin, looking at the crystal champagne flutes securely locked in the center console. He was mentally calculating the cost of the car, the cost of the security detail, the cost of everything. I could almost see his brain overheating. As we hit the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean glittering under the afternoon sun, Cassidy finally broke. Tears began streaming silently down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She wasn't crying out of remorse. She was crying out of sheer, overwhelming intimidation. The convoy finally slowed, turning off the highway and approaching a massive, wrought iron gate set into a high stone wall. The heavy iron gates swung open automatically as Gage's vehicle approached, gliding silently on hidden tracks. We drove up a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges. When the trees cleared, the estate revealed itself. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. 3 stories of glass, steel, and white concrete gleaming in the sun. An infinity pool cascaded over the edge of the property, blending seamlessly with the horizon. Parked near the multi-car garage was a sleek silver Porsche and a vintage Mercedes, toys I rarely drove but kept for the aesthetic. The Rolls-Royce came to a smooth stop in the circular courtyard. Gage opened the door. I stepped out first, breathing in the salty ocean air. Harrison and Cassidy crawled out after me. They stood on the imported cobblestone driveway, their necks craning upward to take in the sheer scale of the property. Harrison looked physically ill. His leased BMW and suburban mortgage suddenly felt like a child's playset compared to this. Cassidy was clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes darting frantically from the infinity pool to the glass balconies. The massive mahogany front door opened. Delaney, my assistant, stepped out wearing a sharp, tailored suit. Behind her stood Nolan, my private chef, wearing a crisp white apron. "Welcome back, Sienna," Delaney said professionally, offering a warm smile. "Chef Nolan has prepared a light lunch in the executive dining room, and the dossiers you requested are resting on your desk." "Thank you, Delaney," I replied. I turned to my siblings, who were staring at Delaney and Nolan like they were aliens. "Follow me. And try not to touch the artwork." I led them through the grand foyer. The ceilings were 20 feet high, adorned with modern chandeliers that caught the sunlight. Our footsteps echoed on the heated marble floors. I did not give them a tour. I did not offer them water. I walked them straight past the massive living area, down a glass corridor, and into my private office. The office was the size of their entire childhood home. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with first editions. The opposite wall was pure glass, offering an unobstructed, terrifyingly beautiful view of the ocean drop-off. In the center of the room sat a massive, custom-built mahogany desk. I walked around the desk and sat down in the high-backed leather executive chair. I did not offer them a seat. There were two small, uncomfortable guest chairs facing the desk, but I wanted them to stand. I wanted them to feel small. Harrison and Cassidy stood awkwardly in the center of the room. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy. "Sienna," Harrison finally whispered, his voice trembling. His corporate arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the desperate pleading of a man who realized he was completely out of his depth. "Please. What is this? Whose house is this? What is going on?" I folded my hands on top of the mahogany desk. I looked at the two thick, manila folders Delaney had placed directly in front of me. "This is my house, Harrison," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "And this is the end of the line for your delusions." I reached forward and flipped open the first dossier. The reckoning had officially begun. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the open folder. "Allow me to introduce myself formally," I began, my tone completely devoid of warmth. "I am the founder and former chief executive officer of EcoTrack. 6 months ago, I sold my software company to a global tech conglomerate for $40 million in cash. I retained a 10% equity stake and a seat on their advisory board." Cassidy let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her knees buckled slightly, and she reached out to grip the back of one of the guest chairs to keep from falling. $40 million, she choked out. Harrison turned ash white. He literally staggered backward, his mouth hanging open. That is impossible. You dropped out. You were living in Koreatown. You wore thrift store clothes." "I wore thrift store clothes to your house," I corrected him sharply. "Because I knew the second you found out I had money, you would swarm me like vultures. I wanted to see if there was any actual family love left in either of you. You proved, spectacularly, that there is not." I looked down at the dossier. "But let's not talk about my finances. Let's talk about yours. Since you two were so eager to drag my financial situation through the mud this morning, I had my private investigators do a little digging into your perfect lives." Harrison's head snapped up, pure panic flashing in his eyes. You hired investigators?" I pulled a sheet of paper from the folder and held it up. "Harrison, you stood in that living room and told Mom you were going to generously pay for her care out of your robust portfolio. But according to these bank records, your portfolio is entirely fabricated. You are currently $2 million in debt. Your house is in pre-foreclosure. You have maxed out 6 different high-yield credit cards just to maintain the illusion of wealth." Harrison swallowed hard, staring at the floor, completely unable to look me in the eye. "And it gets worse," I continued, dropping the paper and picking up another. "Your tech firm placed you on administrative leave 3 weeks ago pending an internal investigation for embezzling company funds. You do not even have a job, Harrison. You were planning to extort $800 a month from me just to pay the minimum balance on your leased BMW." A suffocating silence filled the room. Cassidy stared at Harrison, horrified. "Harry, is that true?" she whispered. Harrison didn't answer. He just squeezed his eyes shut. I closed Harrison's folder and opened the second one. Cassidy immediately flinched, as if I had raised a hand to strike her. "Now for you, Cassidy," I said, my voice relentless. "The queen of the suburban housewives. You gave me a $15 gift card to buy a cheap blouse so I could get a real job. But let's look at your reality. 2 months ago, your husband secretly filed for divorce because he discovered you took out a second mortgage on the house without telling him to fund your designer shopping addiction." Cassidy let out a loud, ugly sob, covering her face with her hands. "Your accounts are empty," I read from the report. "Your car is being repossessed next week. Your entire life is a hollow, miserable lie built for Instagram. You came to that meeting today hoping to bully me into paying, because you do not have a single dollar to your name." I slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet office. "You are both frauds," I stated coldly. "You are broke, miserable, and drowning in debt. And instead of asking for help, you tried to destroy your younger sister to make yourselves feel powerful. You tried to gaslight me, manipulate me, and ruin my credit. You are the most pathetic people I have ever met." Harrison finally looked up. His eyes were red, filled with tears of humiliation. But instead of apologizing, his survival instinct kicked in. He tried to pivot, grabbing onto the only leverage he thought he had left. "Okay, fine," Harrison shouted, his voice cracking. "We lied. Our finances are a mess. But what about Mom and Dad? They still need care, Sienna. They still need that facility. You have $40 million. Are you just going to let them rot because you are mad at us?" I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. He had just walked right into the final trap. "Do not ever try to use our parents as a shield against me," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements, tossing them onto the polished wood. They slid across the desk and stopped right at the edge, directly in front of Harrison. "Pick them up," I ordered. Harrison hesitated, his hands shaking as he reached out and picked up the top page. He scanned the highlighted lines. Cassidy peeked over his shoulder, wiping tears from her cheeks. What is this?" Harrison asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "These are wire transfers. To Mom and Dad's joint medical account. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. For the last 3 years," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. "Every single time Dad had to go to a specialist. Every time Mom needed physical therapy. Every single prescription, every single copay, every single emergency room visit. Who do you think paid for it?" Cassidy gasped, looking up at me in shock. Mom said those were insurance refund errors. She bragged about how good their coverage was. "I was the insurance error," I stated bluntly. "I set up an anonymous shell corporation to wire funds directly to the hospital billing department so Mom wouldn't feel like a charity case. I have been entirely funding their medical survival while you two were busy buying Rolexes and designer handbags with money you didn't have." Harrison dropped the papers back onto the desk. He looked completely defeated, a man who had just been stripped of every single lie he had ever told himself. "As for Sunset Valley Memory Care," I continued, pulling a sleek, silver folder from the stack and sliding it across the desk. "I visited them 2 weeks ago. I met with the director. I did not just reserve a spot for Dad. I purchased the executive suite in the private wing. I set up a fully funded, irrevocable trust that will cover every single expense for both Mom and Dad for the rest of their natural lives. The facility, the private nurses, the physical therapy. It is entirely paid for. 100%. Harrison and Cassidy stared at the silver folder like it was a glowing artifact. Their grand plan to manipulate me into paying for the parents they were neglecting was completely useless. I had already solved the problem before they even brought it up. "You have no leverage," I told them. "You have no power. You bring absolutely nothing to the table. Mom and Dad are taken care of, and they will never have to worry about a single financial burden again. And they certainly do not need the two of you." "Sienna," Cassidy sobbed, stepping forward and reaching her hand across the desk toward me. "Please. I am so sorry. I was horrible. I was so stressed about the divorce, and I took it out on you. We are family. Please, you have so much money. If you could just help me clear the credit cards, I swear I will pay you back. I will do anything." Harrison immediately followed suit, dropping his pride entirely. "She is right, Sienna. We messed up. We were jealous of you when we were younger, and we were projecting our failures onto you today. But I am about to lose my house. I am going to be indicted. If you could just loan me enough to cover the embezzlement, you would barely even notice the money is gone. Please. You are my little sister." They were begging. The golden boy and the perfect daughter, standing in my office, sobbing and begging for a handout from the sister they had treated like trash for a decade. It was the exact outcome I had predicted. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cracked phone. I tapped the screen a few times, turned the volume all the way up, and set the phone down on the mahogany desk. "Before I answer your request for a loan," I said smoothly, "I want you to listen to something." I hit the play button on the voice memo. The audio was incredibly clear. The quiet crickets of the Pine Valley backyard played first, followed instantly by Harrison's cruel, arrogant voice. "She gets evicted from whatever dump she is renting in LA. And then what happens? She has nowhere to go. She will be forced to move back into this house. She can be the free, live-in nurse for Mom and Dad. It solves our problem perfectly. Cassidy's voice followed, laced with a nasty giggle. It serves her right for acting so aloof all these years. Did you see her face when I gave her that cheap gift card? I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and final. Cassidy buried her face in her hands, crying hysterically. Harrison looked like he was going to vomit. They knew there was no walking back from that audio. It was raw, unedited proof of their absolute malice. They didn't want my money to survive. They wanted my destruction for their own convenience. You do not want a sister, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You want a victim. You want someone to look down on so you do not have to face how hollow and pathetic your own lives have become. Well, you picked the wrong victim. I stood up from the desk. The answer is no. I will not give you a single dime to save your house, Harrison. I will not pay off your credit cards, Cassidy. You are going to face the consequences of your own actions. You are going to lose everything, and you are going to have to rebuild your lives from the ground up, just like I did. Sienna, please. Harrison shouted, stepping forward, his hands raised in a desperate panic. You cannot do this. We are blood. Blood is just biology, I fired back, my eyes blazing. Loyalty is a choice. And you chose to betray me the day you stole my algorithm, Harrison. You chose to betray me every time you mocked me, Cassidy. We are done. I pressed a button on the intercom sitting on my desk. Gage. We are finished here. The office door opened instantly. Gage and 2 other security guards stepped into the room. They did not draw weapons, but their sheer physical presence was enough to force Harrison and Cassidy to step back. Escort them off the property, I commanded, turning my back to my siblings and walking toward the glass wall overlooking the ocean. Take them down to the main highway gate. They can call an Uber from there. Do not let them back inside the gates ever again. No. Sienna, wait. Let's talk about this. Harrison screamed as Gage firmly grasped his arm. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Cassidy wailed, dragging her feet as the security team guided her out of the office. I did not turn around. I stood by the glass, watching the waves crash violently against the rocks below. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, cutting off their desperate pleas. The silence returned to my office, but this time, it was not heavy. It was peaceful. A few minutes later, I stepped out onto my massive balcony. The afternoon sun was warm against my skin. Down below, at the very edge of my property line, I saw the 2 tiny figures of my brother and sister standing on the side of the busy coastal highway. They were frantically typing on their phones, trying to find a cheap ride back to the miserable realities they had created for themselves. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, salty air. The ghosts of my past were finally exorcised. I had built my empire from nothing, and I was going to defend it from anyone who tried to tear it down, even if they shared my last name. It has been 6 months since I forced them out of my gates. My dad is receiving world-class care at Sunset Valley, completely oblivious to the drama, fully funded by my trust. But my mom constantly leaves me tearful voicemails. She begs me to forgive Harrison and Cassidy, claiming they are on the verge of bankruptcy and that blood is thicker than water. I refuse to answer her calls or let my siblings anywhere near my empire. After a lifetime of their gaslighting, sabotage, and mockery, I chose to protect my peace. Am I the jerk for holding onto this grudge and refusing to save them from their own ruin? Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to leave your verdict in the comments below. Would you have forgiven them? Or did she do the right thing? See you in the next drama story.